Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here at this wonderful meeting of Caribbean and Canadian scientists, policymakers, etc. So I've been given the task of, go back, of talking about climate change, mitigation, and adaptation strategies. Now, when I talk about my research, I usually talk about my research, the two arms of my research. I research, I'm a biochemist, and I look at plant health, plant diseases. But I also have a foot in, a hand in, human health. And I describe that as my moonlight project. But sitting here today in this space, we realize that climate change affects all of us in all aspects of all our lives. So I don't feel so, what can I say, ashamed to talk about my human health project, as I usually do. I'm going to focus, however, today on my work in plant diseases, and I've titled it Resistance and Resilience in Our Root Crops. Our root crops are these crops you see here. So I talk about resistance and resilience in our root crops, and our root crops are the three that I focus on here are yams, sweet potatoes, and cassava. Sweet potato on my right, for those of you who don't know, cassava in the middle, and yams on my left. I began working as a young student with yams, and in my work over the last decade or so, I've focused on diseases in both sweet potato and cassava. And I've structured my presentation today looking at how we produce our roots and tubers, our production levels. I'm examining the spread and diseases in these root crops in the region, and then I will end with a discussion on mitigation and adaptation strategies based on my work in these crops. And why these crops? Well, when we talk about climate change, food security, and so on, in the Caribbean, any discussion from the policymakers, the scientists, and so on, they always go back to planting more cassava, planting more yams, planting more sweet potato. These crops have sustained us from indigenous communities to our colonial times, even to today. And when we are threatened, we tend to go back to planting more of these crops. However, we can see here that this is from FAO stat, that we've seen increasing production in most countries over the years, again, because of these policies that we have we've imbibed in recent times about the importance of these crops for not only climate change, because they're also described as climate change crops, but we've seen in some countries declines, like Grenada between 2017 and 2020, and in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The reason for this might be manifold, but in many instances has to do with natural disasters like hurricanes, storms. In the case of St. Vincent, they've been threatened not only with storms, but volcano eruptions as well. But over the years, we've had ups and downs in terms of our production levels. In recent times, increases. Of the three that I've studied, sweet potato seems to be the one that is increasing in demand and also increasing in not only consumer demand, but productivity. And the reason is because sweet potato is easy to grow. It's a short crop in terms of its time of about 6 months or so in the ground. It also has, all of these crops have low glycemic indices. And what does that mean? In terms of our staples, compared to rice, pasta, and so on, and the level of NCDs we have in the region, these are said to be better in terms of our carbohydrate sources for our health. This increase in production is also driven by the younger generation who, unlike my generation, would eat these crops in traditional ways, boiled, fried, or steamed, and so on. There is now greater demand for these crops in agro-processed foods. Of note, Red Stripe, you can see it here in the middle there, that company that makes Red Stripe, they are substituting their starch with cassava inputs, which means that in Jamaica, there's been increased production of cassava by small farmers, as well as the company who also owns land, and they are increasing their levels of production as well. Besides red stripe, we have breads, flour, even pasta made from these crops. But we have seen in recent times yield declines in the field, and in my work in the last decade or so, we've been measuring tuber sizes, and we've seen a decline in tuber mass, the weight of the tuber, as well as the yield. And what's driving this is diseases. For sweet potato, mainly virus diseases. And some of the work we did, which we published in 2019, when we surveyed around Barbados, we saw that one of the diseases in sweet potato is a sweet potato virus disease. And that disease can cause leaf deformation, for example. It can cause discoloration and just poor outcomes in terms of yield. One of the things we did, we began to look at using molecular tools, that's looking at PCR, genomics, and so on, to identify these viruses. We found in Barbados, for example, you can see that yellow 5% there. Most potatoes grown in Barbados would have that virus in there. It is not even visible, it's just symptomless, but it's there. And when we talk about trying to produce virus-free plants for the farmers, that becomes a difficult task. But we're told to do so for export reasons and so on. My work also showed that within our local varieties, we have resistance genes, and these genes says to us that we can engage in better breeding programs to highlight what we have locally rather than importing varieties from other countries that may be bringing in these diseases as well. We also did some work on drought tolerance varieties across the region. One of the ones I want to highlight here, the Jamaican variety, that showed very good drought tolerance within the field as well as in our molecular studies. The diagram on the right just highlights a tree diagram and looked at the clusters based on where these varieties were found. Other diseases I've worked with, fungal diseases in cassava. This is a disease I've focused on in the last few years that looks at a disease called super elongation disease. This disease is present in Latin America as well as recent reports for Trinidad in 2007 and our report in 2010 in Barbados. We now have a new report showcasing that this disease is also present where cassava is growing in huge amounts in Jamaica. The current method for diagnosis and so on is basically culturing in the lab and trying to identify it as well in the field. A very difficult task. Our work with molecular diagnostics shows that when we try to identify these isolates and these populations, these plant pathogen populations, we have seen for the cassava disease, almost every isolate in Trinidad and Barbados, as well as the ones in Jamaica, are identical to what we see coming from Brazil as well as Colombia. So we have pathogen spread. With the yam anthracnose, a disease that has been present in the region for decades, we've seen that increasing temperatures, while we have with higher temperatures less epidemics, we know that wind dispersal is a problem, and some work I've done with colleagues in Guadeloupe, where they've tracked the pathogen spread in Barbados, Guadeloupe, and some of the other islands, we see that how the pathogen is spreading within the islands through dispersal by wind and rain is also critical. What does that mean for climate change and adaptation strategies in this space? It means that when we think about diseases and plant diseases in relation to climate change, we have to think about how the pathogen is spreading and dispersal, not just the fact that we have storms and things get wiped out. We have to look at the pathogen population, how that pathogen is adapting to the new modalities of climate change. We need new technologies for diagnosis as well as for growing these crops. We also need better forecasting, AI modeling, smart agriculture. We need better biotechnology applications in terms of answering these questions about the pathogen population and climate change. And so I will end by just thanking my students and former students, my university and current students for their support of this work over the last few years. Thank you.